The night was bitterly cold, the kind that cut through even the thickest of coats. James Hall, a man known for his relentless ambition and icy demeanor, walked briskly through the rain-slicked streets of the city. The glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement as he headed back to his penthouse after a late-night business meeting. Despite his wealth and success, James often preferred to walk home in the evenings. It was a rare moment of solitude in his otherwise chaotic life, a chance to clear his mind and reflect on the deals that kept his fortune growing. But tonight, something felt different. As he passed an alleyway, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He hesitated, something he never did, and turned his head toward the dimly lit space between two old brick buildings. There, huddled in the shadows, was a small boy, no older than 10. His clothes were tattered, soaked through from the rain, and he was trembling violently from the cold. The boy sat with his back against the wall, hugging his knees to his chest, his wide, hollow eyes staring blankly into the distance. James's first instinct was to keep walking. Homelessness was a common sight in the city, one he'd long grown accustomed to ignoring. But something about this boy made him stop. Maybe it was the child's frailty or the way his eyes, though dull with exhaustion, seemed to hold a trace of hope. For a moment, James stood frozen in place, torn between his usual indifference and an unfamiliar tug of empathy. He had never been the type to care about others. His focus had always been on his empire, on maintaining his power. But something in this boy's quiet desperation spoke to him. Without fully understanding why, James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. His fingers grazed over the thick wad of bills inside as he paused. He knew the boy would never expect anything from him, and certainly not money. With a sigh, James took out $125 and stepped toward the boy. The boy's eyes flickered with confusion as James crouched down and extended the money toward him. For a moment, the boy didn't move, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "Here," James said gruffly, not quite meeting the boy's gaze. "Take this. Get yourself something to eat, and find somewhere warm." The boy's hands shook as he reached out to take the money, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, sir," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. James stood up, feeling a strange sense of discomfort wash over him. He wasn't used to moments like this. He preferred the cutthroat world of business, where everything was calculated and controlled. This, helping a stranger for no reason, was unfamiliar territory. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his expensive shoes clicking on the wet pavement. As he continued down the street, the image of the boy lingered in his mind, unsettling him in a way he didn't quite understand. The $125 he had given was nothing to him, a mere fraction of his wealth, but the way the boy had looked at him, as if he were a lifeline, made the gesture feel heavier. By the time James reached his penthouse, the boy was almost forgotten. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into his usual routine, already shifting his focus back to the business deals he had in motion. He had no idea that the small act of kindness he had shown that night would come back to him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. For James, it was just another night. For the boy, it was the beginning of something far greater. 25 years had passed since that cold, rainy night, but to James Hall, it felt like a lifetime. The relentless march of time had not been kind to him. Now in his 70s, the sharpness of his once commanding presence had dulled. The empire he had built, once sprawling and powerful, was still intact, but James had retired from the public eye. His days of controlling boardrooms and sealing high-stakes deals had faded, leaving behind a man surrounded by wealth yet utterly alone. James sat in the grand living room of his mansion, the fire crackling softly in the background. The mansion was a stunning display of affluence. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, priceless artwork, but it felt cold, lifeless. He could feel the weight of the emptiness pressing in on him, a stark contrast to the bustling life he had once led. The estate was vast, but now it served as a reminder of what he had lost over the years: connection, love, and family. He reached for a glass of whiskey from the polished table beside him, his hands trembling slightly. His health had begun to fail a few years ago. At first, it was minor: aches, fatigue. But soon it escalated. Doctors' visits became more frequent, and while James had the best medical care money could buy, there was no escaping the inevitable. He glanced at the mantel, where photos of his past life stood as silent witnesses to his isolation. Pictures of his children, now grown and living halfway across the world, flashed before his eyes. They barely spoke to him anymore. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. They had drifted apart years ago, the result of too many broken promises, too much time spent focusing on his business instead of his family. He had always thought his wealth would be enough for them, but he had been wrong. His marriages had been equally empty. 2 wives had come and gone, each leaving in search of something James couldn't offer: love, affection, a real connection. They had found his wealth appealing at first, but it wasn't long before they realized his fortune was no replacement for the warmth of a loving relationship. Now, he was alone, the memories of those failed relationships haunting the hallways of his mansion. James leaned back in his chair, letting out a weary sigh. He had everything he had ever wanted: money, power, influence, yet it all felt hollow. What good was his fortune when it couldn't cure the loneliness that gnawed at him every day? His mind wandered to his past, as it often did in these moments of reflection. He remembered his early days of building his empire, how ruthless he had been in business, cutting down competitors and climbing to the top of the financial world. At the time, it had seemed worth it. He had believed that wealth could solve everything. But now, sitting in the quiet solitude of his mansion, he realized how wrong he had been. His thoughts drifted further back, to a night he rarely thought about anymore. The night when he had given $125 to a homeless boy in an alley. It had been such a small moment, one that barely registered in the whirlwind of his life. But now, as he reflected on it, he wondered what had happened to that boy. Did he survive? Did that small act of kindness make a difference? James shook his head, dismissing the thought. It didn't matter. He had barely thought about it since then, and he doubted the boy even remembered him. He was just another person James had passed on the streets, another fleeting moment in a life filled with more important concerns. Still, the memory lingered longer than usual tonight. As James sat in his massive, empty house, he felt the pang of regret that had become all too familiar in recent years. He had spent a lifetime building his fortune, but what had it all been for? His legacy was wealth, but there was no one left to share it with, no one who truly cared. The fire crackled louder, pulling James from his thoughts. He stared into the flames, the warmth doing little to comfort the chill in his bones. Time was running out for him, and for the first time in his life, James was beginning to realize that money couldn't buy him the things that truly mattered. As the night wore on, James drifted off into a restless sleep in his chair, unaware that his past, embodied by that small boy he had once helped, was about to knock on his door and change everything. The rain drummed lightly against the tall windows of James Hall's mansion. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, making the night feel even more isolated than usual. Inside, the house was silent, except for the occasional crackle from the fireplace. James, lost in a restless sleep, stirred in his chair, his mind drifting through fractured memories of his younger days, boardrooms, celebrations, and brief glimpses of his estranged family. Suddenly, the loud sound of knocking shattered the stillness. James's eyes snapped open. He sat up, disoriented. For a moment, he wasn't sure if the knock had been real or if it had come from some distant dream. He waited, his heart pounding, unsure if he had imagined it. Then it came again, a firm, deliberate knock at the front door. James frowned, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was late, far too late for visitors. He lived in a sprawling mansion at the edge of the city, a place that rarely saw anyone but his housekeeper or delivery drivers during the day. But at this hour, the knocks came again, more insistent this time. With a groan, James pushed himself up from his chair, his aging body protesting every movement. He grabbed his cane, using it to steady himself as he shuffled across the marble floor toward the door. The flickering shadows from the fire followed him down the long hallway. When he reached the door, James hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He couldn't remember the last time someone had come to visit him unannounced, especially at this hour. A strange sense of unease settled in his chest, but curiosity drove him to twist the handle. As the door swung open, James found himself staring at a tall man standing on the porch, drenched from the rain. The man looked to be in his mid-30s, sharply dressed in a dark suit, though his clothes were soaked through. He held a sleek black briefcase in one hand, and his dark hair clung to his forehead from the downpour. But it wasn't the man's appearance that startled James. It was his eyes. There was something about them, something oddly familiar that made James pause. He had seen those eyes before, though he couldn't quite place where. "Mr. Hall?" the man asked, his voice steady despite the cold rain pelting down around him. James blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, that's me," he replied slowly, his grip tightening on the door. "Who are you?" The man smiled, a calm, confident smile that made James's pulse quicken, though he wasn't sure why. "My name is Nathan," the man said. He paused for a moment, as if carefully considering his next words. "You won't remember me, but we met a long time ago. 25 years, to be exact." James frowned, confusion knitting his brow. He studied Nathan more closely, trying to place him, but nothing came to mind. "I don't know what you're talking about. How do you know me?" Nathan's smile softened, and he took a small step forward. 25 years ago, on a cold, rainy night, you gave a homeless boy $125 in an alleyway." James's breath caught in his throat. The memory hit him like a wave, flooding his mind with images of that night. Him standing over a small boy, the feel of crumpled bills in his hand, the boy's wide, hollow eyes as he took the money. It was an act James had long forgotten. But now, hearing those words, it all came rushing back. I remember," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Nathan nodded. "That boy was me." James stared at him, speechless. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what Nathan had just said. The man standing before him, the successful, confident man, was the same boy he had encountered in the alley all those years ago? It seemed impossible. "I've been looking for you for a long time," Nathan continued, his voice calm but full of emotion. "You might not think much of it, but that $125 saved my life. It got me through the worst days. It gave me a chance when I had nothing." James felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation building in his chest, something between disbelief and hope. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please come in." Nathan entered, shaking off the rain as he stepped into the warm glow of the mansion. James led him into the living room, where the fire still burned low. They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling flames the only sound between them. James's mind was still spinning. He had given the boy $125 and walked away, never thinking about it again. But here was Nathan, sitting across from him, looking like a man who had built a successful life for himself. "I can't believe it," James muttered, finally breaking the silence. "You were just a boy." Nathan smiled again, but this time, there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I was, and you were the only person who showed me any kindness. That night changed everything for me." James leaned forward, his hands trembling. "What happened to you after that? How did you find me?" Nathan set his briefcase on the table, taking a deep breath. "That's a long story, but I'm here now because I wanted to thank you. I wanted you to know that you made a difference in my life." James stared into the flames, his heart heavy. In all his years, he had built fortunes, created legacies, and made countless business deals. But nothing he had done felt as meaningful as the small act of kindness he had shown that boy. As the fire flickered and the rain drummed softly against the windows, James felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A chance for redemption. James stared into the flickering flames, the weight of Nathan's words sinking in. He couldn't fully grasp the reality of it. How a single act, something he had barely thought about afterward, had led this man to his doorstep 25 years later. The room was silent except for the soft crackling of the fire and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Nathan leaned forward slightly, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. His expression was calm, but there was a depth in his eyes that told James his story was not an easy one. I've thought about this moment for a long time, Nathan began, his voice low but steady. I never knew if I would find you, but I always hoped I would. You changed my life, Mr. Hall, even though you probably don't remember me. James nodded, still unable to fully process the weight of Nathan's presence. I do now, he said softly, but I never imagined. I never thought something so small could matter that much. Nathan gave a half smile, the sadness in his eyes deepening. For you, it was small. But for me, it was everything. The firelight danced across Nathan's face as he began to tell his story. 25 years ago, Nathan had been just a boy, no older than 10, living on the streets. He had ended up there after a series of tragedies that had left him alone in the world. His mother, who had struggled with illness and poverty for years, had died suddenly, leaving him with no relatives and no place to go. He had been taken to a shelter at first, but it was overcrowded, and eventually, he found himself wandering the streets, sleeping in alleys, and begging for scraps of food. I didn't have anyone, Nathan said quietly, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing those dark days all over again. Every day was a fight to survive. I thought about giving up more times than I can count. I was just a kid, and I didn't know how to live like that. James listened in silence, his heart heavy. He had never imagined the boy he had encountered was fighting such a desperate battle for survival. One night, Nathan continued. It was freezing cold. I didn't have a jacket, barely had shoes on my feet. I sat in that alley, thinking that this might be the end of the line for me. And then you walked by. James swallowed hard, the memory clearer now. He could see it in his mind's eye, Nathan, sitting against the wall, shivering and small. The way his eyes had looked, so hollow yet hopeful. He had given the boy $125, but he hadn't thought much about it afterward. When you handed me that money, Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion, I didn't know what to say. I'd asked people for help before, and no one ever stopped. But you did. You gave me more than just money that night. You gave me hope. James felt a lump forming in his throat. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to look away from Nathan's gaze. I used that money to get off the streets, Nathan explained. I went to a shelter where they helped me clean up, gave me food, and pointed me toward resources I didn't know existed. I was able to buy a hot meal, get new clothes, and start looking for work. James nodded slowly, the gravity of Nathan's words pressing down on him. You found work? At that age? Nathan smiled, a trace of pride in his voice. Yeah, it wasn't easy. I started out cleaning tables in a diner. The owner took pity on me when he saw how hard I was trying. He gave me a few shifts a week, and I saved every penny I made. Over time, I worked my way up, from dishwasher to cook to manager. It took years, but I never stopped pushing. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he listened, captivated by the story of resilience. He realized that Nathan wasn't just a survivor, he was a fighter. Eventually, Nathan continued. I saved enough money to start my own business. It was small at first, a food truck. Actually, I had learned enough about the restaurant business by then to know what worked. The food truck did well, and before I knew it, I had 2 more. And then a restaurant. James stared at him, his mind reeling at how far the boy had come. From homeless to a restaurant owner, because of a single moment of kindness. I never forgot you, Nathan said, his voice quieter now. I never forgot that night. I always told myself that if I made it, if I ever became someone, I'd find you and repay the debt I owed you. James felt a lump in his throat. Nathan, you don't owe me anything. What I gave you that night, it was nothing compared to what you did with it. I had no idea. Nathan smiled softly. Maybe I don't owe you in the way you think. But that money, that act of kindness, it kept me alive. And it made me believe in the goodness of people. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. James sat back, letting the silence fall between them for a moment. He had spent decades building fortunes, making deals, and controlling businesses. But never had he felt as humbled as he did in this moment. A simple act, one he had almost forgotten, had made such an impact. I came here, Nathan said, breaking the silence, because I wanted to do more than just thank you. I've started a foundation. We help kids who are homeless, just like I was. I want you to be a part of it, James. You can make a difference in more lives than you ever thought possible. James blinked, the offer taking him by surprise. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, but this was different. This was a chance to do something meaningful. Nathan reached across the table and placed a business card in front of him. Think about it. I wouldn't be here without you. And I know there are others who need that same chance. James stared at the card, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a chance to leave a legacy that wasn't just built on money, but on something far greater. The crackling fire seemed to soften the weight of Nathan's story, but it couldn't ease the heaviness in James's chest. He sat back in his armchair, his hands resting on the arms, gripping them lightly as if trying to steady himself. His mind was spinning. So much had been said, yet the meaning of it all felt like it was just starting to sink in. He picked up the business card Nathan had placed on the table. The white card felt crisp between his fingers, embossed with simple lettering. The New Horizons Foundation, helping homeless youth rebuild their lives. Beneath it, Nathan's full name, Nathan Cole, and his contact details. James traced the letters with his thumb, feeling the weight of what this card represented. A chance, not just for the children Nathan was helping, but for James himself. Nathan's voice broke through the quiet. It's not just a charity, Mr. Hall. The foundation is personal for me. Every child we help is a child I see a reflection of myself in. I want them to know that there's hope, that their lives can change just like mine did. James set the card back down, his eyes meeting Nathan's. There was something so genuine in the younger man's expression, something James had rarely seen in the world he once ruled. It wasn't ambition driving Nathan, or a hunger for power or wealth. It was compassion, the desire to give back in a way that felt real, that made a tangible difference in the world. And for a man like James, who had spent his life in a relentless pursuit of success, that kind of purpose seemed foreign. You've done more with your life than I ever did, James admitted quietly, his voice tinged with regret. All my years chasing after more money, more success, and for what? I built an empire, but now I'm sitting here in a house too big for one man, too empty for any meaning. Nathan leaned forward, his gaze steady. You built something incredible, Mr. Hall. You have the means to change lives in ways most people could never imagine. That $125 changed my life, but think of how many lives you could change with everything you've built. James felt the words land like a punch to the gut. For so long, he had believed that his fortune would define him, that the legacy he left behind would be measured in dollars and corporate accolades. But now, as he stared into the fire, the flames flickering and casting shadows across the room, he realized how hollow that idea had become. All the money in the world couldn't fill the void in his life, the chasm that had opened up as his family drifted away, as his friends faded, as his health began to fail. But this was different. What Nathan was offering wasn't just a chance to give. It was a chance for redemption, a chance to leave something behind that mattered. What exactly are you asking of me? James asked, his voice gruff, though not unkind. Nathan smiled softly, as if he had been waiting for that question. I'm not asking for money, not yet anyway. What I'm asking for is your involvement. I want you to come to one of our centers, see the work we're doing firsthand. Meet the kids. Talk to them. They need someone like you, someone who's lived a life of success but knows that it's not just about wealth. They need someone who can inspire them, someone who can give them a different kind of hope. James felt a flicker of something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't excitement, not exactly, but a kind of curiosity, mixed with a cautious sense of purpose. It had been so long since he had done anything that wasn't strictly business. He couldn't remember the last time he had been part of something bigger than himself. But could he really do this? Could a man like him, who had spent his entire life chasing power and prestige, find a way to give back? To make his life mean something more than just numbers on a balance sheet? The thought was daunting, and for a moment, James considered saying no. It would be easier to stay here in his mansion, to let life go on as it had for the past few years. His health was failing, after all, and what difference could an old man like him really make? But as he looked at Nathan, who had once been a lost, homeless boy, James knew the answer. One act of kindness had changed Nathan's entire life. What if James could do that again? On a larger scale, for more people. He set the business card down gently, his fingers trembling slightly from age. "I don't know if I'm the man for this," James admitted, his voice low. "But I'll come. I'll see what you're doing." Nathan's face lit up with gratitude, his eyes brightening. "That's all I'm asking for," he said softly. "Once you see the work we're doing, I think you'll understand why it's so important." James nodded, though the doubt still lingered in his mind. He wasn't used to feeling unsure of himself. In his world, certainty was power. But now, as the fire dimmed and the rain outside slowed to a gentle patter, James found himself wondering if this uncertainty was exactly what he needed. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to find something greater than himself, something that could bring meaning to the last chapter of his life. Nathan stood, signaling that it was time to go. "I'll send a car for you next week. You can meet the team, see the work firsthand." James rose to his feet, his knees aching from years of wear and tear. "Next week, then," he agreed, though the words felt heavier than they should have. This wasn't just an appointment on his calendar. It was a step into the unknown, a step toward something that could change everything. As Nathan left the mansion, disappearing into the dark, rainy night, James sat back down, staring into the dying flames of the fire. The silence returned, but it no longer felt as oppressive. For the first time in a long time, James didn't feel quite so alone. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The week passed slowly, a strange mix of anticipation and hesitation weighing on James as each day crawled by. He couldn't shake the conversation with Nathan from his mind. His life had been structured around routines and careful control. Meetings, wealth management, maintaining his estate. But now, a sense of unease gnawed at him. The thought of stepping out of his isolated existence and into Nathan's world felt daunting, even unnerving. Each night, James found himself staring into the fire, replaying fragments of his life. Memories came in waves, uninvited but relentless. His first $1 million deal, the office celebrations, the feeling of invincibility that once defined him. But then came the cracks, the moments where things began to slip away. His first wife's cold departure, his son's bitter words before he left for good, and the growing void that had spread through his family like a cancer. They had all drifted away, and James had let them. It had seemed natural at the time. Business came first, always. The empire he built was a shield, a fortress he thought would protect him from the world, but now he saw it for what it really was, a gilded prison. And now, as he moved through the quiet rooms of his mansion, he felt the weight of every missed opportunity to connect with the people he should have loved the most. The night before Nathan was set to pick him up, James had trouble sleeping. He tossed and turned, haunted by the question he had buried for years. What had it all been for? The wealth, the power. It had brought him everything he thought he wanted, but in the end, it had left him hollow. Nathan's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that his life didn't have to end this way. By the time the morning arrived, James was exhausted, but resolved. He couldn't go back to the man he was before. Not now. The clock had just struck noon when a sleek black car pulled up to the entrance of his estate. From his study, James watched as Nathan stepped out, looking polished and confident as always. For a brief moment, James considered canceling. He could make an excuse, say he was too old, too tired, too sick. But he knew the truth. He was afraid. Afraid of facing the world, of seeing what had happened while he had locked himself away. With a deep breath, James straightened his jacket and walked toward the door, his cane tapping softly against the marble floor. When he opened it, Nathan greeted him with a warm smile, the kind that seemed to carry no judgment, only understanding. "Ready?" Nathan asked, his voice calm and reassuring. James gave a small nod, though he felt anything but ready. "As ready as I'll ever be." They drove in near silence, the city slowly coming into view as they left the sprawling countryside behind. James stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape change from rolling estates to the busy streets of the city. The buildings, once symbols of his dominance and power, now seemed distant, like relics of a life that belonged to someone else. "You nervous?" Nathan asked, breaking the silence as they approached the city's heart. James hesitated, then nodded. I haven't done anything like this in, well, I don't know if I've ever done anything like this. Nathan chuckled softly. I understand. It's a different world, but I think you'll find it worth the trip. James wasn't sure if he believed him, but there was no turning back now. The car slowed as they reached a quiet part of town, far from the towering skyscrapers and bustling business districts James had once ruled. The neighborhood looked modest, even run down in places, but there was a sense of community here, a warmth he could feel even from behind the car's tinted windows. Children played in the street, and families chatted on their front porches. The car pulled up in front of a large building with a sign that read, New Horizons Foundation. Rebuilding lives, one step at a time. The building was simple but inviting, a far cry from the sleek, modern offices James had spent his life in. Nathan led him to the entrance, and as they stepped inside, James was greeted by the sound of laughter, conversation, and the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the background. The center was bustling with life. Young people, teens and children, some no older than Nathan had been when James had met him, milled about, talking to counselors, playing games, and sitting in small groups. The atmosphere was light, full of energy and optimism. It felt worlds away from the cold, transactional world James had grown accustomed to. Nathan walked him through the halls, explaining the work they did at the foundation. We take in kids from all walks of life, homeless, runaways, those who've fallen through the cracks of the system. We give them shelter, food, education, but most importantly, we give them hope. A chance to build something better. James listened carefully, trying to absorb it all. They passed a small group of teens gathered around a counselor, their laughter filling the room. In another area, a young girl sat with a tutor, working through a math problem with a determination that reminded James of his own drive, back when he was starting out. What you're seeing, Nathan said softly as they walked past the classrooms, is what your generosity started. That night, you gave me hope. Now, we're doing the same for them. James felt his throat tighten. He didn't know how to respond. He had never thought of himself as a man capable of creating something so good, so pure. All his life, he had defined success by money. But this was different. This was real. Nathan stopped in front of a glass door leading to an office. There's someone I'd like you to meet. James followed him inside, and sitting behind the desk was a woman in her mid-40s, her expression warm and welcoming. Nathan introduced her as Elena, the director of the foundation. She had been working with Nathan since the early days, helping him build the center from the ground up. Mr. Hall, it's such a pleasure to meet you, Elena said, shaking his hand with genuine enthusiasm. I've heard so much about you. Nathan tells me you were the one who inspired all of this. James shook his head, a little overwhelmed. I didn't do much. It was Nathan who built this. But without your help that night, none of this would have happened, Nathan added quietly. Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest impact. James looked around the room, seeing the faces of the kids outside. Their lives forever changed because of this place. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of pride, but it wasn't the kind that came from closing a deal or making money. This was different. This was pride in knowing that he had done something good. As they spoke, a teenage boy entered the office, nervously shuffling his feet. He looked no older than 15, his clothes worn and his hair unkempt. Elena introduced him as Marcus, one of the newest arrivals at the center. Marcus had been homeless for several months after running away from an abusive home. He had been living on the streets, much like Nathan once had, before the foundation took him in. James watched as Nathan spoke to Marcus with kindness, offering words of encouragement and telling him about the opportunities ahead. The boy's face lit up, and for a moment, James saw himself in Marcus, young, ambitious, and full of potential. But unlike James, Marcus hadn't been given the same opportunities in life. Until now. Later, as Nathan and James walked back to the car, the weight of everything he had seen pressed down on him. James stopped just before reaching the door, his hand resting on the car's cool metal frame. Nathan, he said, his voice quieter now, I want to help. I don't know how, but I want to be part of this. Nathan smiled, the warmth in his eyes reflecting the gratitude James had given him so many years ago. We'll find a way, Mr. Hall. There's always a way to help. As the car pulled away from the foundation, heading back toward the mansion, James felt something shift inside him. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel the cold emptiness that had defined his life. Instead, he felt hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to make a difference. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, the sound of the car's engine a low hum beneath the weight of James's thoughts. He gazed out the window at the passing city, watching the streets shift from the vibrant, bustling neighborhood surrounding the foundation to the quieter, wealthier enclaves closer to his estate. Each passing block seemed to mirror his own emotional journey, from the lively hope he had witnessed at the center to the loneliness that awaited him back home. Nathan had dropped James off earlier, offering a reassuring handshake and promising to be in touch soon. As the sleek black car pulled into the long driveway leading to his mansion, James felt the emptiness of his grand estate closing in again. The towering trees and perfectly manicured lawns, once symbols of his success, now felt like barriers separating him from the world outside. When the driver opened the door for him, James stepped out slowly, his body aching from both age and the weight of everything he had seen that day. He entered the mansion, the echo of his cane tapping against the marble floor following him through the wide halls. Every step deepened the sense of isolation he had grown so accustomed to, an isolation that now felt unbearable. James paused at the entrance to his study, his hand resting on the doorframe as he gazed at the familiar surroundings. The room was filled with reminders of his past, awards and plaques lining the walls, photographs of him shaking hands with powerful men, and business contracts that had once meant the world to him. But now, they felt hollow. Each accolade, once a source of pride, now seemed insignificant compared to what he had witnessed at the foundation. Nathan's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest impact. He entered the study and sat down in his favorite armchair by the fire. As the flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows across the room, James felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. The memories were sharp, cutting through the years of self-imposed isolation. Memories of deals made, fortunes won, and, more painfully, the relationships he had sacrificed along the way. James reached for the glass of whiskey on the side table, his hand trembling slightly. He took a slow sip, the warmth of the liquor doing little to ease the cold ache in his chest. His mind drifted back to the one thing he had tried to bury for years. His family. His first wife, Claire, had been with him in the early days of his rise to wealth. They had been young, ambitious, and deeply in love. Or so he had believed. But as his business grew, so did the distance between them. James had become obsessed with success, spending long nights in the office and endless hours traveling for deals. Claire had begged him to slow down, to spend more time with her and their young son, Daniel. But James had brushed off her concerns, convinced that he was building a legacy for them, that the sacrifices were necessary. Then came the day Claire left. She had packed her bags quietly, taking Daniel with her. James had come home to an empty house, a note on the kitchen counter explaining that she couldn't do it anymore, that the man she had fallen in love with had disappeared beneath the weight of ambition. At the time, James had been angry. How could she leave when he was providing everything for her and their son? He had thrown himself even deeper into his work, using it as a shield to avoid confronting his own failures as a husband and father. And Daniel, he had grown up without a real father. James had missed school plays, birthdays, and all the small moments that mattered. When Daniel turned 18, he had moved across the country, wanting nothing to do with his father. They hadn't spoken in years. James set the glass of whiskey down, the sound of it landing on the wooden table sharp in the quiet room. He stared into the fire, his thoughts growing darker. His life, built on power and wealth, had left him alone. His children, distant and estranged, no longer cared to call or visit. His friends had drifted away, and the few people who still worked for him did so out of obligation, not loyalty. He had always believed that his legacy would be defined by his success, by the fortune he had amassed. But now, as he sat alone in his grand mansion, he realized that his legacy was one of broken relationships, of people he had pushed away in the pursuit of more. For years, James had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, that providing for his family financially was enough. But now, in the quiet of the mansion, he understood how wrong he had been. His wealth had become a fortress, a barrier that kept the people who mattered most at arm's length. And now, in his twilight years, there was no one left. He thought of Nathan again, the boy who had been homeless, lost, and forgotten. James had given him a small amount of money, something that had meant nothing to him at the time, but it had meant everything to Nathan. That small act had changed the course of Nathan's life, leading him to build something meaningful, something far more valuable than wealth. James wondered if it was too late for him. Could he, at 73 years old, still change his life? Could he find redemption in the time he had left? He had seen the joy and hope in the faces of the kids at the foundation. He had felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a desire to do something good, something that wasn't motivated by profit or self-interest. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it might be too late for him. Too late to repair the damage he had done to his family. Too late to build real relationships with the people who mattered. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the air. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes growing heavy as exhaustion settled over him. But even as sleep tugged at the edges of his consciousness, the regret lingered. He could no longer hide from it, no longer bury it beneath layers of wealth and success. The next morning, James woke with a sense of resolve. His body ached as usual, his movements slow and stiff, but something inside him felt different. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring back his marriage or undo the damage with his son. But he could change the future, if only in a small way. He stood and walked to his desk, picking up the business card Nathan had given him. The New Horizons Foundation, rebuilding lives, one step at a time. He ran his thumb over the embossed letters, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. James reached for the phone and dialed the number printed on the card. The line rang twice before Nathan's voice answered, warm and familiar. "Mr. Hall," Nathan said, his voice filled with surprise. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." James hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Nathan, I've been thinking. I want to help, more than just a donation. I want to be involved, in any way you need me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Nathan's voice came through, full of gratitude. "We'd love to have you, Mr. Hall. There's a lot we could use your help with." James nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "Let's make it happen." As he hung up the phone, James felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't know if it was too late to fix the relationships he had broken, but it wasn't too late to do something good. He could leave behind a legacy that mattered, not measured in dollars, but in lives changed. For the first time in decades, James felt that he was on the brink of something new, something meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so empty. Weeks passed since James made his call to Nathan, and his days took on a new rhythm, one that felt both unfamiliar and refreshing. Instead of staring into the quiet emptiness of his mansion, he now spent several days a week at the New Horizons Foundation. The more time he spent there, the more he saw the transformative power of the work being done. It wasn't just about providing food or shelter. It was about restoring dignity, giving hope to kids who had been overlooked by society, just as Nathan once had. James had started small, offering his business expertise to help with fundraising strategies and improving the foundation's operational efficiency. But as the weeks went by, he found himself drawn into the deeper, more personal aspects of the work. He met with the kids, listened to their stories, and saw firsthand the weight they carried. Many of them reminded him of Nathan, lost, angry at the world, and wary of trusting anyone. But there were moments of light, moments when a breakthrough would happen, and James could see the spark of hope in their eyes. It was during one of those moments that James realized something profound. This was what he had been missing all along. Not the rush of closing a multi-million-dollar deal, or the thrill of watching his bank accounts grow. No, what filled the void was something much simpler. Knowing he was helping these kids find a way forward, giving them a chance at life that had once been denied to them. It was the first time in decades that James felt his life had real meaning again. But just as he began to find purpose, his health started to falter. It began with a dull ache in his chest one evening as he sat in the foundation's office, reviewing some paperwork with Nathan. He had brushed it off, thinking it was just fatigue, or perhaps indigestion. He was an old man, after all, and the occasional discomfort was something he had grown used to. He had never been one to complain about aches or pains. But the pain didn't go away. In fact, over the next few days, it grew worse. Sharp pangs would seize his chest unexpectedly, leaving him breathless and lightheaded. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that he could push through it, that it was just a temporary setback. But as the weeks wore on, his body started to betray him in ways he couldn't control. One morning, as he dressed to leave for the foundation, he collapsed in his bedroom, barely able to reach his phone to call for help. The pain was searing, and for the first time, James felt true fear. Not the fear of losing money or power, but the fear of losing his life. The next thing he remembered was the sterile whiteness of a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors, and the tightness of oxygen tubes in his nose. The doctors had told him that he had suffered a mild heart attack. Mild, they said, but it didn't feel mild to him. His body felt weak, frail in a way it hadn't before. He was no longer the imposing figure who had once dominated boardrooms. Now, he was a man staring down the fragility of life itself. Nathan visited him every day, bringing updates on the foundation's progress and sharing stories about the kids. He always managed to lift James's spirits, even when the doctors brought news of more tests, more treatments. But despite Nathan's encouragement, James couldn't shake the growing sense of time slipping away. He could feel it in the way his body refused to recover, in the way each breath felt just a little bit harder to take. It wasn't just his body that was failing. His mind, too, had begun to wander to places he had long tried to avoid. The mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt, the family he had lost. The hospital room became a place of reflection. The world outside continued to spin, while James remained tethered to his bed, a silent spectator to his own decline. He thought often of Daniel, his estranged son. He wondered where Daniel was now, whether he had a family of his own, whether he ever thought about his father. The silence between them had stretched so long that James wasn't sure how to bridge it, or if it even could be bridged. He replayed the day Claire had left, the sound of Daniel's voice calling after her as she packed up the car. Daniel had been just a boy, confused and hurt by his father's absence, too young to understand why James wasn't there for him. That memory, more than anything, haunted James in the long, sleepless nights at the hospital. He had thought that providing for them financially would be enough, that they would understand his sacrifices in time. But now, after all these years, it was clear that he had misunderstood what mattered most. It wasn't the money. It was never the money. It was the time he had lost, the relationships he had let slip away because he was too focused on building an empire. And now, as his body weakened, time was the one thing he couldn't buy back. One afternoon, Nathan sat by James's bedside, reviewing plans for an expansion to the foundation. They had received a generous donation from an anonymous benefactor, enough to open a new shelter on the other side of the city. James listened, smiling weakly, as Nathan spoke with enthusiasm about the future. "You've done more than I ever could have imagined," James said, his voice hoarse and strained. "This foundation, it's your legacy." Nathan shook his head. "It's ours, Mr. Hall. Without you, none of this would exist." James closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. It felt good to know that, in the end, he had helped build something meaningful, something lasting. But there was one thing left that weighed on his heart, something he knew he needed to do before it was too late. "Nathan," James said softly, opening his eyes again, "I need your help." "Of course, anything," Nathan replied, his brow furrowing with concern. "I need you to find my son," James said, his voice trembling. "Daniel. I haven't spoken to him in years. I don't even know if he'll want to see me, but I need to try." Nathan nodded, his expression somber. "I'll find him, Mr. Hall. We'll get in touch with him. But don't worry, you still have time." James wasn't so sure about that, but there was a quiet relief in knowing that, at the very least, he had taken the first step. He had spent his life building a fortune, but now, at the end of it all, the only thing that truly mattered was the chance to say sorry. The chance to make things right, if only for a moment. Nathan left that afternoon, promising to start the search for Daniel. As the door closed behind him, James lay back against his pillows, his mind drifting. He thought of the kids at the foundation, the lives he had touched in his final years. He thought of Nathan, the boy he had saved so long ago, and the man he had become. And he thought of Daniel, the son he had failed, but hoped to reach, even if it was only to say goodbye. The hospital room was bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, the sterile white walls softened by the warm light pouring through the windows. The days had begun to blur for James, each one feeling like a slow drift between wakefulness and uneasy sleep. His body, once strong and commanding, now felt fragile, like a weight he was slowly losing the strength to bear. But it wasn't the physical weakness that troubled him most. It was the waiting. The waiting for news about his son, Daniel, the son he hadn't spoken to in years, the son whose childhood he had missed. Nathan had promised to track Daniel down, but as the days stretched on, James wondered if his son would even want to see him after so many years of silence. Nathan visited daily, bringing updates on the foundation, trying to lift James's spirits with stories of the kids they were helping. He would sit by James's bedside, telling him about the expansion plans, the new partnerships they were forming, and the success stories coming out of the shelters. James listened, nodding and smiling weakly, grateful for the distraction. But every conversation inevitably turned back to one question. Had Nathan found Daniel? On the fourth day after James had asked for Nathan's help, the answer finally came. It was late afternoon when Nathan walked into the room, his face more serious than usual. James, who had been dozing lightly, stirred at the sound of the door opening. He sat up slowly, wincing as the familiar ache spread through his chest. "Mr. Hall," Nathan began, sitting down beside him, "I found Daniel." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight of the past. James's heart skipped a beat, a rush of anxiety and hope flooding his system all at once. "Where is he?" James asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Nathan hesitated for a moment before continuing. "He's in California. He moved there a few years ago. I spoke with him briefly." James's pulse quickened. "You spoke with him? What did he say?" Nathan's expression softened with understanding. He was surprised, to say the least. "It's been a long time, Mr. Hall, but I told him that you wanted to see him. I explained everything." James swallowed hard, the familiar guilt rising in his throat. "Did he agree to come?" Nathan nodded. "Yes. He's on his way now. His flight arrives tonight." James exhaled slowly, relief and fear washing over him in equal measure. Daniel was coming. After all these years, after all the hurt and resentment that had built up between them, his son was coming. For the first time in a long while, James felt a flicker of something he had almost forgotten: hope. That evening, the hospital room felt different. The usual silence seemed heavier, more tense, as James waited for the arrival of his son. The doctors had offered to move him to a quieter part of the hospital, away from the constant buzz of machines and the clatter of nurses, but James had refused. He wanted to stay here, where he could see the door and know the moment Daniel arrived. Hours passed, and James's anxiety grew. He hadn't seen Daniel since he was a young man, fresh out of high school, angry at his father for years of neglect. What would he say? What could he say to make up for all the lost time, all the missed birthdays, graduations, and milestones? Would Daniel even want to hear him out? James glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past 9 p.m. now. Daniel's flight should have landed an hour ago. His nerves frayed with each passing minute, his mind racing with thoughts of everything that could go wrong. And then, the door creaked open. James's breath caught in his throat as he turned his head toward the doorway. There, standing hesitantly at the threshold, was Daniel. He was taller than James remembered, his dark hair flecked with a few strands of gray. He looked older, more mature, but his face still carried the sharp features that James recognized as his own, just a younger, stronger version. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel lingered in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room before finally landing on his father. There was a guardedness in his expression, a wariness that made James's heart ache. This was his son, his boy, who had once looked up to him, who had once wanted nothing more than to be like him. And now, they were little more than strangers. "Daniel," James whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You came." Daniel nodded slowly, stepping into the room but keeping his distance. His arms were crossed over his chest, his body language closed off, protective. "I came," Daniel said, his tone neutral. "Nathan told me you wanted to talk." James swallowed hard, the weight of what he needed to say pressing down on him. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and hoping for. He didn't know where to start. How could he explain years of absence? How could he make up for all the times he had chosen his career over his family? "I'm sorry," James began, his voice trembling. "I know I failed you. I know I wasn't there when you needed me. His words faltered as he searched for the right way to express the guilt he had carried for so long. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought building the business, giving you and your mother financial security, would be enough. But I was wrong. So wrong." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching his father struggle with the words. "I missed everything," James continued, his chest tightening with emotion. "I missed your childhood, your milestones. I wasn't there, and I can never undo that. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how much I regret it." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady beep of the heart monitor beside James's bed. Daniel stood silently, his expression unreadable, as his father's words hung in the air between them. James's hands trembled as he reached out slightly, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. "I don't have much time left, Daniel. I don't want to leave this world without at least trying to make things right with you." Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Do you even know what it was like, growing up without you? You weren't just gone. You were absent. I needed a father, not just someone to send checks." James's heart clenched. "I know. I failed you, Daniel, and I'm so sorry." There was a long silence, and James's chest felt tight, both from the weight of the moment and the strain on his heart. He could see the anger, the hurt, still lingering in Daniel's eyes. It might have been too late to change things, too late to mend the years of damage. But then, something in Daniel's expression softened, just a fraction, but enough for James to notice. "I didn't come here for an apology," Daniel said, his voice still guarded. "I came because Nathan told me about the foundation. He said you've been working there, helping people. I guess I wanted to see for myself if you've really changed." James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had changed, or at least, he was trying to. The foundation, the kids, the work with Nathan. It had all shown him that his life could mean something more than just money and success. But what mattered most was that Daniel had come. His son was standing in front of him, and there was a chance, a small one, but still a chance, that they could rebuild something, even if only a fragile understanding. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Daniel said after a long pause, "but I'm willing to try. Maybe we can start from here." James felt tears welling in his eyes. He had spent a lifetime building walls, hiding behind power and wealth, but now those walls were crumbling. All he wanted, more than anything, was this chance. "Thank you," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Daniel." And for the first time in decades, James felt that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something real. The days that followed Daniel's visit were some of the most emotionally charged of James's life. His body was weakening, the doctors now more focused on keeping him comfortable than on any real chance of recovery. But for the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace, knowing he had finally reconnected with his son. Daniel returned the next day, and the day after that. At first, their conversations were stilted, full of pauses and the weight of unspoken emotions. But slowly, they began to talk, not just about the past and the hurt that lingered, but about their lives, about the foundation, and about Daniel's future. James learned that Daniel had started a family of his own. He had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter, Lily, both of whom he spoke about with a warmth that reminded James of what he had lost. Still, Daniel hadn't fully forgiven his father. There was too much pain, too much distance between them. But the fact that he was there, sitting by James's bedside, was more than James had ever dared hope for. One afternoon, Daniel brought Lily to the hospital. She was 6, with bright blue eyes and a wild head of curls that reminded James of his own youth. As soon as she saw her grandfather, She smiled shyly, clutching her father's hand. "This is your grandpa," Daniel told her softly. "Say hello." "Hi, Grandpa," Lily said, her voice soft but curious. James's heart swelled. He had never imagined he would live long enough to meet his granddaughter, let alone see the next generation of his family. He felt a tear slip down his cheek as he smiled at her, too overcome with emotion to speak. It was as if, in this small, innocent child, he saw a second chance, a chance to leave behind something other than wealth and a broken family. Lily climbed onto the bed carefully, sitting beside James as Daniel watched. James reached out slowly, his hand trembling, and Lily took it without hesitation. Her small fingers wrapped around his, and in that moment, James felt a warmth he hadn't known in decades. "Grandpa's sick," she whispered to her father. Daniel nodded gently. "Yes, sweetheart, but he's happy you're here." James managed to pull together a smile. He squeezed Lily's hand gently and whispered, "Thank you for visiting me." As the days passed, James spent more time with Daniel and his family. They visited the hospital regularly, and slowly, the ice between father and son began to melt. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but they were trying, and that was enough for James. He had missed so much of Daniel's life, but in these last moments, he was finally reconnecting with the family he had pushed away for so long. 1 week later, the time came. James's health took a sudden, steep decline, and the doctors informed him that he didn't have much longer. Nathan visited daily, bringing updates on the foundation and sitting with James as he grew weaker. But there was a quiet understanding between them now. Nathan didn't need to fill the silences with words anymore. They had done enough talking. Now, they just needed to be present for each other. On James's final morning, he awoke to find Daniel sitting beside him, holding his hand. The room was filled with a calm stillness, the early morning light filtering through the window, casting soft shadows on the walls. Daniel had brought with him something James hadn't expected, a photo album. It was filled with pictures of Lily, of Daniel and Sarah, of the life Daniel had built in California. James flipped through the pages slowly, his hands weak but determined, his eyes lingering on each photo as if trying to imprint them in his memory. "I wanted you to see her grow up," Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted you to know that she's going to be okay. We're going to be okay." James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had no more regrets. He had done what he could in the time he had left, and now, he was ready to go. His family was here, and that was more than he had ever dared to hope for. "Thank you," James whispered, his voice barely audible, "for giving me this." Daniel squeezed his father's hand. "Thank you for trying, Dad. I'm glad we had this time." As the hours passed, James's breathing grew more shallow, his body more still. Daniel stayed with him, holding his hand, refusing to leave his father's side. Nathan came to visit briefly, and James gave him a small nod of gratitude. There was nothing more to say. Nathan knew what James felt, and James knew the legacy he was leaving behind. That afternoon, James Hall passed away peacefully, surrounded by the people who mattered most. A few weeks later, the mansion that had once been James's fortress of solitude was now transformed. Nathan, Daniel, and the board of the foundation had worked together to convert it into a new shelter and educational center for homeless youth. The Hall Center for Hope stood as a beacon of second chances, offering shelter, guidance, and hope to those who needed it most. It was a place where lives could be rebuilt, where stories like Nathan's could be repeated, and where James's legacy would live on, not through his wealth, but through the people he had helped. At the grand opening of the center, Nathan stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. Daniel stood beside him, holding Lily's hand, both of them quietly watching as Nathan spoke. James Hall was a man who built empires, but more than that, he was a man who learned that true success is measured by the lives we touch, Nathan said, his voice steady but full of emotion. This center is his gift to the world, a place where people can come to find not just shelter, but a new beginning. As the applause died down, Daniel stepped forward, lifting Lily into his arms. He gazed at the center, knowing that this was the real legacy his father had left behind, a legacy of hope, of healing, of redemption. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt at peace with his father's memory. James had finally found his way back to the things that mattered, even if it had taken him a lifetime to get there. And in that small moment of reflection, Daniel knew one thing for certain. His father's final years had been the best ones of his life, not because of the money he made, but because of the lives he had changed.